There Will Be Blood is a 2007 American film written and directed by Paul Thomas Anderson. It is loosely based on Upton Sinclair's novel Oil. The film itself chronicles the business decisions and actions taken by fictional oil tycoon Daniel Plainview in between the years of 1898 and 1927 during the Southern California oil boom. Within the 2.5 hour runtime, the viewer will see Daniel's humble beginnings as a prospector as well as his rise to becoming an extremely rich and powerful oil man. This plot by itself might seem a bit dry and boring, especially to those of you not particularly interested in oil men, but let me assure you that I am only giving you the most basic of basic plot outlines, and that much happens before the credits finally roll. Also, it is important to note that this film is primarily a character study. The film is less about how Daniel's actions are linked to his inevitable rise to power, and more about what these actions reveal about his character and what kind of man he is. Early on in the film, and this happens in the first 15 minutes of the film, so it is not really a spoiler, Daniel adopts the child of one of his colleagues who dies. This action is important to the film not only because of the importance it has to the plot, but also because of the questions that it raises for Daniel's character. Did he take the child in because he felt like it was his duty? Did he do it because he has a desire to have a family? Or did he just do it so that he could appear like a sympathetic family man to his investors? There's evidence within the film that points to multiple answers, and thus it is up to the viewer to decide what they think. And the truth is that this is one of the reasons why I hold this film in such high regard. In reality, the film's plot is fairly simple and clear. I've never heard anybody who couldn't follow what was going on, but enough information about the characters and what certain actions are supposed to mean is left ambiguous enough that one can think about it and interpret the film long after watching. Now it is inevitable that any reviewer who talks about this film is going to have to touch upon the Academy Award winning performance that Daniel Day-Lewis gives as Daniel Plainview. This is not only because the performance has garnered so much praise, but also because his performance is so pivotal to the film's success. Daniel Plainview is in about 95% of the film, and when he isn't present, characters are usually talking about him. Everything else in this film could have been perfect, but if Lewis dropped the ball in his performance, then the film would have been a failure. At least that's my opinion. That is why all of those who were involved in this film should feel thankful, because here, not only is Daniel Day-Lewis successful in his portrayal of Mr. Plainview, he also gives what I believe might be one of the greatest film performances of all time. In every scene, he completely dominates, and I can never keep my eyes off of him. One of the reasons why I feel his performance is so great in particular is because it has a fair amount of range. There are scenes where Daniel Day-Lewis just has to make business speeches in a calm manner, and those scenes are very entertaining just due to the way that Lewis is able to deliver his lines. There are also scenes where he becomes very subdued and opens up his true nature to those around him in very soft spoken words, and those scenes are extremely effective in drawing you in while simultaneously giving off a very unsettling feeling. And finally, there are scenes where he becomes a raving lunatic and displays the, if you forgive me for using a somewhat cliched line, beast within, and those scenes are as entertaining as they are frightening. Also, and this is in no way meant to insult the masterful screenplay that Paul Thomas Anderson wrote for this film, there are multiple times when Daniel has to say things that could have so easily come off as being silly. The final scene especially comes to mind. But Lewis is able to provide every single line in action with so much intensity and emotion that nothing ever seems forced. Although, to be frank, some scenes are supposed to be darkly comedic, at least as was written on the summary on the back of the Blu-ray case, so don't feel too guilty if you find yourself chuckling at a few parts. But now that I have spoken about the big show-stopping performance of the film, I would like to also comment on the, in my opinion, underrated performance that Paul Dano gives as the religious man, Eli Sunday. Now, throughout the film, Eli is the closest thing to an antagonist that the plot has. He is a character that not only stands up to Daniel to challenge his power, but also serves as a nice foil to Daniel. While Daniel is always very cold and strong, Eli gives off a comparatively warmer and weaker vibe. He appears to help the community through the church, something that Daniel only promises to do through his oil drilling. And unlike Daniel, he is part of a larger family, even though it is somewhat ambiguous how righteous and good-hearted Eli really is. There is evidence that suggests that he might just be a greedy and power-hungry man. Paul Dano's performance really helps the character seem weak and young, especially when compared to Daniel. It is also important to note that Dano's performance also helps Lewis's, since it gives him such a great thing to play off of. Literally every scene in which these two characters are present gives me goosebumps and is easily as intense as any gunfight from any western that I have seen. I must also give special mention to the opening 15 minutes of this film. In the beginning of this film, there's absolutely no dialogue, and for the first 6 minutes, you don't see any characters except for Daniel. But despite this, the film is able to reveal to the viewer so much about Daniel, such as how he is a hard worker, as well as a terribly lonely and antisocial person, just through clever use of cinematography and Lewis's performance. Within this time, Paul Thomas Anderson is able to completely sell the viewer on Daniel's character without ever succumbing to one word of dialogue. It also has some audio and visual elements that seem to pay homage to Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece 2001, and anything that can remind me of 2001: A Space Odyssey is a good thing. In fact, the first 15 minutes are so good that if the film ended after this section, my only complaint if I saw this in the theater would be that $15 might have been a steep price for a 15-minute short film. Also, the cinematography by Robert Elswit in this film is brilliant. As I have hinted before, the character Daniel Plainview is a very lonely man, and while this is of course reinforced by Lewis's performance and the events of the film, it is a trait that is also suggested to the viewer through the cinematography. Much of the cinematography in the film plays with space and is set up to show the audience an extremely barren and lonely environment, usually only broken up by a few oil derricks in the distance. This lonely environment, in my opinion, is able to really drive home the loneliness of Daniel in a way that isn't annoyingly patronizing to the audience. I must also mention that in the special features of the Blu-ray, which is the way that I viewed this film, there's a special feature where a number of old photos and documentary clips from the time period being depicted within the film are shown. Presumably, the filmmakers used these for inspiration and research. Interestingly enough, many shots in the film are set up to look exactly like some of these old photos and pieces of footage. While watching, many of these photos and clips were still in my mind and gave the film an eerie sense of realism, which is also accented by the fact that in some scenes you can notice some of the oil getting onto the lens of the camera. In fact, eerie and depressing are two words that I would use to describe the overall tone of this film. Thanks to the excellent, sometimes subdued, sometimes intense soundtrack by Jonny Greenwood, who seems to use mostly period-appropriate instruments this time around, the film is able to sustain this feeling of dread that something is going to go horribly wrong. And as a side note, some of my favorite tracks used in the movie are Open Spaces, Prospector's Arrive, Convergence, and Proven Lands. This feeling is also accented by the sounds and motion that a lot of the equipment makes while people are drilling for oil. The film does a good job of giving weight to a lot of the equipment used, which really makes it feel like something is going to go horribly wrong once there is one slight miscalculation. While this dread might turn off some, in truth it is one of the film's main strengths, and, at least in my opinion, it makes sure that things never get boring. Not that the film needs this dread to keep the audience interested, because my god, is the dialogue in this film masterfully written and performed. The character of Daniel is so well written that he, despite some of his more monstrous traits, seems like a real person. Plus, while the majority of the film, minus the opening of course, might be composed mostly of characters talking to one another, there are still enough beautifully executed set pieces and character confrontations that make sure that the film never devolves into just a very well written radio drama. Also, and I don't know how others may feel about me saying this, but There Will Be Blood, at least to me, is one of the most American films I have ever seen. There's just something about the depressing story of a man who starts off with seemingly nothing and then through hard work, intelligence, and negotiation skills is able to become an extremely wealthy and bitter man that just screams America. And if you think I'm hating on America by saying that, let me just say this. For all my life, except for one 3 week period, I have lived in the United States. And while I can certainly say that a large number of things are pretty messed up about the country, I do still view it as being mostly alright. One last thing I would like to mention is the nice poetic touches that are included within this film. One example of this is when Daniel first strikes oil within the first 15 minutes of the film. At this moment, instead of showing an expression of satisfaction to his workers, he instead puts some oil on his hands and then shows his palms to his workers. This action of him dirtying his hands is not only another action that reinforces his antisocial nature, it is also symbolic of how his ambitions as an oil man will ultimately cause him to dirty his hands later on in the film, if you catch my drift. Now that I have successfully driven home the fact that I adore this movie, you're probably wondering if there are any flaws. And to be frank, there are things that you could complain about if you wanted. I mean, about 95% of the characters are Caucasian males, although I guess it wouldn't exactly be too accurate if the film didn't depict big business people in turn of the century America as Caucasian males. Also, some of the set pieces and dialogue might seem a bit over the top to some, but frankly, I don't really care about these things. If Paul Thomas Anderson were to make this film again and ask me if I wanted any changes, I would tell him to do everything exactly the same. That is not to say that I feel this is a perfect film, rather I feel it is a true work of art, and to change anything would be to betray Paul Thomas Anderson's artistic vision. While I personally think everyone over the age of 14 should see this film, I do recognize that not everyone will like this film. I still see people sometimes complain that the film is too slow, or that it is too grim, or that none of the characters are particularly likable. Even so, I believe that everyone should give this film a shot, and I would recommend it to pretty much everybody. And to those of you worried about violence, I wouldn't worry too much. For a film with blood in the title, there is actually not that much of the red stuff. It seems that ever since Shakespeare released Macbeth out to the public a few centuries ago, we as a people have been constantly infatuated with the tried and true story of people becoming corrupted as they rise to power. While There Will Be Blood is a film that technically follows this framework, it does so in a truly artistic way that feels fresh while simultaneously making its evil, greedy businessman into a believable and understandable person, although I wouldn't go as far to say that he is sympathetic. And it is for these reasons that I believe that There Will Be Blood is one of the best American films to have been released in the 21st century so far. I would now like to take this time to thank you for listening to a fanboy rave about a film that they really enjoyed for a way too long. Um, if you have any opinion to share about this film or any thoughts, you are of course welcome to leave a comment. And I'm not sure if I'm going to do this or not, but while watching this film, I took a lot of notes about stuff that I just found interesting, which I mostly left out of this review for the sake of not spoiling the film for anybody who hasn't seen it yet. If in the future I make a video where I talk about these things, it would of course be a bit more ad-libbed. For this video, I was reading a review that I wrote up beforehand. But anyway, if any of you are interested in me making that video, you can also express the interest in the comments or whatever. So thanks for watching.